Okay, it's 5:01. Good evening, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today. I'm Baptista. I'm a psychiatrist and the clinical vice chair at Columbia Psychiatry, and I have the privilege of being here tonight as your host and the panel moderator. We have a terrific lineup of panelists that I can't wait to introduce to you, who will share insights and have a conversation about a topic that is of great importance to all of us, our youth mental health. So the purpose of this panel is to provide factual information, clarify some misperceptions, and delve into a conversation about youth mental health from a historic, developmental, contextual, and media reporting point of views. But before I introduce our lined up of panelists, I just want to take a brief moment for some housekeeping. So just to remind you that this panel is hosted jointly by the Department of Psychiatry at Columbia University and the Columbia University Graduate School of Journalism. We also have great partners that are supporting this event, such as the National Action Alliance for Suicide Prevention, Mindful Philanthropy, the Carter Center, the Association of Healthcare Journalists, investigative reporters, and editors. Also, this panel will be recorded and will be downloaded tomorrow on our YouTube channel and will be distributed by email. And we certainly encourage everyone to send your questions using the question and answer functions. We do have some questions that were sent to us ahead of time, and we will try to get to as many as we can. So enough of me talking. So let me introduce you to our superstars for this evening. So starting with Dr. Warren Ng. Dr. Ng is a professor of psychiatry at Columbia University Medical Center. He's also a director of population behavioral health at New York Presbyterian Hospital, Columbia Medical Center. And he happens also to be president-elect of the Academy of Medicine Psychiatry. We also have Dr. Eichler, who's the executive director of Columbia University Counseling.
Dr. Baptista, can you remove your papers from the microphone? We can hear them shuffling.
I'm sorry.
I can't hear you. No problem.
So Dr. Eichler is the executive director of the Columbia University Counseling and Psychological Services. Dr. Eichler has over 35 years of experience in practicing college mental health, and we're very eager to hear about his expertise and experience in this field. We also have Rory Linani. She's an education reporter from Milwaukee Journal Sentinel. She specializes in youth mental health and solution-oriented journalism. Rory was also a fellow with the Rosalind Carter Mental Health Journalist Program, and she co-produced an Emmy-winning documentary about young people navigating mental health challenges. We also have Dr. Mark Olson, who is a professor of psychiatry, medicine, and law, and also a professor of epidemiology at Columbia University. So as you can see, I could keep going on and on and on about the accomplishments of our panelists, but that will take the whole night. So let me get into our conversation. So Mark, let's start with you. So the good news is that the media is paying attention to mental health. At the same time, the headlines might give the public sometimes the impression that everyone is struggling, including our youth, that every youth in the US is in need of psychiatric evaluation or treatment. So before we delve into talking about the psychological impact of the pandemic, I thought that perhaps we could take a step back and trying to ground this conversation with you walking us through some historical trends of mental health in the youth in the US leading up to the pandemic. I think that will give the audience some solid grounds for the rest of this conversation. What do you say about that?
Okay, well, thank you, Leo. And thanks for inviting me to the panel this evening. You know, I think getting a sense of the big picture and what the world was like in the years leading up to the pandemic may helpfully, frame our discussion this evening. And I agree with you. It's good news that mental health in youth are getting more attention in the media, but I do think there's this exaggeration that's occurred in the sense that can sometimes convey the sense that all youth are in need of mental health care. Now, at the same time, though, so if we're thinking about the years leading into the pandemic, there is consistent evidence from several large-scale studies of increases in depressive symptoms and their related disorders, as well as declines in a range of other measures of psychological well-being of youth in the United States. So to give you an example, we know from the trends from Monitoring the Future, this is a study, when you look at the trends, we're looking at 8th, 10th, and 12th grade students, over 1 million of them. We did see during the period 2007 to 2018, a doubling in the proportion of girls who had who had significant depressive symptoms. And during roughly that period, there was a near doubling, although the rates are lower, in the proportion of boys that had significant depressive symptoms. And during this period, we've also seen rising rates of psychiatric hospitalizations and major depression, suicidal ideation and suicidal behavior, and tragically even suicide itself. All of these things up during the decade leading up to the pandemic. And in relative terms, some of the most striking increases have occurred among adolescent girls, especially Black adolescent girls. So as an example, to look at the suicide rates between 2010 and 2019, we see an increase of about 30% among adolescent boys, about up 50% among Black adolescent boys, about 70% up in white adolescent girls, and up a little over 100% among Black adolescent girls. Let me contextualize this by saying, fortunately, we're talking about still a relatively small numbers, but my point is that the numbers were growing during this decade. If there's any good news in all of this, it's that during this decade, we also saw some evidence of declining use of illicit drugs in young people. And that's not something I think you would pick up from just reading stories in the media, but we have seen that during this period, and it makes the trends in depression and suicidal behavior, I think, more difficult to understand. And there are a variety of factors that have been hypothesized or speculated to be driving these trends, and I'm sure we'll be getting into them this evening.
Great. So along those lines, now delving into more about this last year and the pandemic, what have we learned so far of how things have changed related to youth mental health during the pandemic?
Yeah, well, as I'm sure you know, and we all know, that 2020 was really a year like no other. And again, recall that we're going into this with this deterioration or this downward trend in the mental health of adolescents and young people in the United States. It's probably too early to determine the full impact, or it's certainly too early to determine the full impact of the pandemic on youth mental health. But there have been 12 longitudinal studies, 10 of which are from the United States, that have evidence or that have ratings before and after the pandemic. And they suggest that these increases in depressive symptoms I've been talking about have continued during the pandemic. On the good news side, we haven't seen rises in anxiety as one might have thought we would see. The increases in depression during the COVID period appear to occur both for younger and for older adolescents. And they appear also to be a little bit worse, as one might expect, for those who are under lockdown, when the measurements are taken during lockdown restrictions. There have also been some studies of mental health services, like rates in hospitalization, for psychiatric hospitalization, emergency department visits. These are difficult to interpret because I think a concern over transmission of COVID has resulted in declines in hospitalizations overall. So I don't think we can take solace from the fact that there's some evidence that there have been fewer hospitalizations, of psychiatric hospitalizations during this most recent period. There does also appear to have been, though, a proportionate shift in emergency department care toward mental health. Not an absolute growth in the number, but the proportion of children being with of the emergency department visits that are mental health has gone up by about a quarter during the pandemic and about a third, by a little less than a third, by adolescents. The other point I want to make is that we've also seen a shift in treatment and how treatment's delivered. I think the pandemic, and here we don't have a lot of evidence, but there's the sense from reports from individual institutions that there's been a shift toward telepsychiatry, towards text and app-based therapy, more remote medication management. These are things that were happening already, but I think it's pretty clear that the pandemic has accelerated these shifts. And there's a lot, and we still don't have a lot of solid evidence on what these shifts have meant for the effectiveness of treatment. So there's some questions there as well.
Terrific. Thank you. So don't go anywhere. I'll circle back to you soon. So turning to you, Warren. And so you as a child psychiatrist, so let's focus on children and adolescents. So we do know that people show signs of distress very differently from each other. That includes kids and adolescents. And one of the factors associated with these variations is where they are developmentally. So could you expand on that? What, as a clinician, working with youth, particularly children and adolescents, what can you tell us about the developmental differences when kids are, dealing with the stress? And then, particularly during this pandemic, what should parents and caregivers pay attention to?
Thank you so much, Dr. Baptista, and it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for creating this space for dialogue, as well as to understand the meaning of numbers, and most importantly, the meaning of stories. So one thought is, I just wanted to take a pause and reflect on this past year, because when we think about the impact, not only on children and adolescents, but it's also acknowledging the impact on all of us. And this year has been, as Dr. Olson said, a year like no other, with longstanding racial, social, and health injustices that have been revealed, but also exposed, even though they've been here for a long time, but acknowledging the systemic and structural racism and inequities within our systems affecting children and adolescents. Because as we all know, children and adolescents are like sponges. They are a part of their environment, and what happens around them affects them greatly. And as Dr. Olson wisely said, we won't know the full impact of this year for years to come. However, what we do know is that the psychological and mental health shadow cast by this year is much longer and enduring than 1 year, and there's no vaccine for that. So I think as we're thinking about children and adolescents and their developmental impact, I always think that every generation and every time has a name, and in the media, there's been acknowledgement that these are the quarantines or the coronials instead of the millennials. But what we do know is that as a generation, or as this group of young people, understanding what they've experienced, but also the impact and what they'll need going forward is really important. And so that brings me to the developmental perspective. As you mentioned, children and adolescents are moving targets. The beauty is that they're still growing up, they're still maturing, but what happens to them can affect the trajectory of their direction, as well as the speed and evolution of their growth and development. So as we think about children and adolescents, and we can appreciate that 50% of all adult mental health conditions presents itself before the age of 14, and that 1 in 5 children or adolescents will have a mental health condition, what we're looking at is really large numbers, as well as another silent epidemic within an epidemic. So I think that one of the things that I would like to share, as you've mentioned, is not only the impact of the pandemic, but also how does it affect children and adolescents. And the one thing that I mentioned, aside from being sponges, is that children and adolescents are affected by their environment. That's their schools, their socializations, their routine, their family and their friends. but not all of them are impacted equally. And so we can appreciate that there's a difference in terms of children of color, low income kids, as well as kids living with less advantages. However, one of the things that we do definitely know is that children are very affected by those around them, their parents and the guardians, so how they're coping with the pandemic and how they've demonstrated resilience as well as coping skills is a really important part of what they can come out of this experience with, hopefully tools instead of injuries. So communication is the key when it comes to kids and adolescents. Part of that communication is listening. And sometimes we don't do as much of a good job listening as we do talking to kids and adolescents. And we need to do that within a developmental frame. So part of understanding that developmental frame is often listening so that we can understand what are the issues that are most important to them and what can be really important to learn and as well to their development. I think limiting the amount of media, as much as we're talking about journalism here, is also really important for children and adolescents, because sometimes it's hard to make sense of the information, and it's also important to help to translate them. And as a part of how kids consume media and everything else, it's also limiting their time with their devices, as hard as that is, but also focusing on the time that they have with real people, like family dinners, being able to really meaningful spend time with kids and adolescents, but also giving positive attention and praise when it's deserved, but also to acknowledge how important they are in the context of all of these things. So I think, as you mentioned, Dr. Baptista, kids are different, and younger kids definitely are much more dependent on their parents. So understanding how they're managing and maintaining routines and structure and physical activity are really important. And as kids get older, it's also really important to give them choices and engage them in a decision making, as well as understanding how they can make a difference in their own lives. I think that with teens and tweens, that's when the natural history for many of the anxiety and mood disorders appear. And similar to puberty. So it's really mindful to be able to be observant, but also learn and listen from our teens to understand what they need. But maintaining regular sleep and activity, maintaining that communication so that we can connect to understand the real questions that are lurking behind and underneath the behaviors, but also understanding how important social activities and peer relationships are. It's not that parents aren't important, but peers are really critical to the development of young people, particularly adolescents. But it's also allowing them to negotiate and having a part of the control and the ownership, especially during times when there may not be as much control over things that are safe, particularly with social distances or mask wearing. So I think that it's also important for our young people to validate the disappointment of the past year and lost opportunities, and to acknowledge that that was then, and hopefully working towards a future where there are different opportunities. But in terms of validating that disappointment, that's really important. I know that Dr. Olson also shared some of the statistics with regards to the differences in 2019 compared to 2020, looking at the emergency department visits. And really sort of by comparison, the proportion of mental health visits during that period of time for 5 to 11-year-olds, increasing by about a quarter, and increasing about a third for 12 and 17-year-olds. It's important to understand the data, but also the limitations of it. But what is important is the young people. So I think it's really important, I think as you've mentioned, Dr. Baptista, it's really to be aware that when we're talking to young people, we need to also listen and also to be mindful of their developmental role as well as where they are to have the most impact.
Thank you, Warren. So let me ask you a different question. I think both, being child mental health providers, we often, hear concerns from caregivers and parents about this last year, what often they call the lost year of milestones and transitions and celebrations. and questioning, can my child ever recover from this last, year or so of adversity? At the same time, when we read the literature on resilience, right, building resilience is associated with going through experiences of challenge and adversity. So looking ahead, will this experience make our youth more adaptable and resilient? Or are we expecting actually a future with more challenges and mental health struggles?
Well, thank you. I think that the beauty of the challenge and the struggle is really the opportunity. So how do we make meaning for young people of what they've experienced, whether or not it's the lost year, the lost opportunity, but also what does it mean? Was it an opportunity to learn? Was it an opportunity to reflect on what's most meaningful? And I think for each one of us during this past year, hopefully we've learned things about ourselves that we can hold on to. And those are the important lessons, as well as opportunities to share with young people. First, validate the fact that there is a loss and that there is experience of not having to do the same things in the same way. But then there's also the opportunity to learn to do things differently, or to learn to see what's most important and where are your priorities and how do we align them with our values and the people that are most important to us. When we think about coping in the context of difficult times and opportunities and adversities, we think about what do we have control over, what don't we have control over? What is the meaning of the things that we do? How are they aligned with our values and the things that are most important to us? So I think that these are opportunities for young people to not have a lost year, but maybe a year of reflection, maybe a year of growth internally, and maybe a year for all of us to be able to see what matters most for us. I think that young people will be young people. That's the beauty of it. However, the resilience lies in the opportunity as well as the meaning in which we understand our experiences. So I think teenagers, that's why I love working with teenagers. They'll tell you where it's at. They don't really shroud anything, but their experience. So I think it's important for us to listen, to validate, and also hopefully to reframe and to bring meaning to the experience.
Thank you, Warren. That was really terrific. So Rich, let me turn to you. So Mark started with giving us great grounding information on the trends of youth mental health leading up to the pandemic. I thought perhaps we could do the same with you, but focusing on college students. You have over 35 years of on-the-ground experience. So before we talk about the psychological impact of college students during the pandemic, could you share with us as well, like Mark did, some of the trends? What have you experienced, in the years leading up to the pandemic regarding mental health utilization from college students, the most common challenges and struggles and presentations that you have seen all those years?
Well, thank you for the question, and thank you for inviting me to this very important panel. Yes, I've been doing this longer than I care to admit, though it remains tremendously rewarding. The utilization of mental health services on college campuses has increased markedly, according to all the best national data during the time that I've been in the field. Probably the most reliable source of data with respect to utilization that we have is a survey that's distributed by the Association of University and College Counseling Center Directors annually, starting back in 2006. And when it was first implemented, and it's distributed to about 800 directors of campus services, and I think about 500 to 600 typically respond, at least in a good year. And when the survey was first initiated, nationally, about 10% of students on college campuses accessed on-campus mental health services over the course of a year. The last year that this survey was distributed prior to the pandemic, that number was up to 13%, which may not sound like a lot, but it's a 30% increase. So the question becomes, why the increase? And I think to understand it, I'll go right to the headline. I think if you build it, they will come. I think it's more a product of access than anything else. I think those figures are sometimes utilized, and go back to some of Dr. Olson's remarks, to assert that there is increasing mental health problems in the college population. Whether that's true or not, we have other data that suggests that access may be the single largest determinant of utilization. And I'll give you two examples of that. The first is, if we look at the utilization rates on small college campuses versus large universities, schools with 1,500 students or less, the most recent utilization data suggests that 19% of students access services. Schools with 35,000 students or more, the figure is 8%. Now, why? Well, if you have 1,500 students on a campus and you hire 3 counselors, you have 3 staff for every 500 students. To replicate that ratio in a large university, you would have to have 70 counselors, and very few universities have either the resources or the will to have such robust mental health services. There are a handful that do. They tend to be, not surprisingly, schools like the Ivy League schools in Stanford and MIT, schools with a lot of resources. And the rate of utilization in those schools tends to be 20%, 25%, even 30% or more. You could argue that these populations are vastly different, but even if there's some truth to that, I think access is the key here. And of course, it underscores the dramatic inequities in mental health care in this country in general. What we're seeing on college campuses, I think, reflects something that Dr. Ng has already spoken about, at least implicitly, which is access to services in communities of color and poor communities. That speaks to another trend, by the way, which perhaps I can circle back to later. The students on campus today are not the same as the students 35 years ago. And I think that's a good thing. It's a much more diverse population. There are more students of color. There are also far more international students, which is very important to talk about because they have faced some different challenges than American-born students. But to get back to your original question, in terms of the problems that students present with, in some ways they haven't changed much in surveys and in my own observation. Anxiety, depression, relationship problems, non-specific stress, sleep problems remain the leading problems that students will describe as being the reasons for seeking services. But with respect to that non-specific stress, there's some very interesting data as well as clinical observation. There was a survey done by the American Psychological Association a couple of years ago. They did a Harris poll of the so-called Gen Z, and that makes up the students who are on campus today. And compared to the preceding generation, the so-called millennials, as well as compared to adults, they are much more stressed, so they say, by world events, by political events, notably, among other things, gun violence, which is not terribly surprising when you consider the conditions under which they grew up. This is the generation that grew up hiding under their desks and preparing for mass shootings. It's the generation of all these unfortunate, well-publicized killings from nursery schools to high schools to colleges. It's also a generation that seems to be much more concerned with racial inequities. In the survey that I'm describing, they're much more concerned with the deportation of undocumented immigrants. And this is not in the survey, but in my own observation, a lot more concerned with their future as reflected by climate change, as reflected by concerns about financial security, which has been shown to be a major stressor and a major correlate with regard to the mental health of our college students. There's a lot more that I can say, but I realize there are a lot more questions to come.
Now, this is great. So let's stay on it. Something that you said about the change in demographics of college students of the last 3 decades. And you mentioned students of color and international students. Perhaps you could expand a little bit more on the unique mental health challenges that these students have faced and what can be done to help them.
Well, I really appreciate the question, because implicit in the question is the notion that not, and this was discussed earlier, that not all of the psychological problems that these students manifest are a reflection of intrinsic psychiatric disorders. In fact, some of what we see are understandable reactions to corrosive social conditions, including with students of color, especially various forms of racism. I mean, the George Floyd killing is one in a long and monotonous litany, right, of instances of racialized violence. And students of color, particularly young Black men, who are wary, who are feeling very stressed, very concerned about their safety. These are not imagined problems. These are real problems. And we have to take care to not inadvertently pathologize reactions to these social conditions, which is not to say that a person's vulnerabilities and their strengths won't mediate their responses to various stressors. But I think it's exceedingly important that we acknowledge those stressors. And here I'm going to echo the wise words of Dr. Ng, which is that we have to validate their experience. And there's perhaps no age, maybe I'm saying this because this is the age that I've worked with for so many years, where this is more important than in late adolescence and emerging adulthood. If one thinks back to childhood and society, which I think many of you are familiar with, if only from your college days, and Erik Erikson's notion that there needs to be an iterative dialogue between the individual and the social surround, that people at this stage of life need to be mirrored and affirmed by their society in order to find a social niche in which they can feel like their authentic selves. That's a critical component of the college years. Erikson referred to these years as a psychosocial moratorium, where young people can experiment with different identity choices. Well, if what's being reflected back is fundamentally in the form of microaggressions or covert racism, we have a real problem. And some of that can be internalized. It can lead to imposter syndrome. There's a whole body of research that I think is very valuable that was conducted by the former provost of this university, Claude Steele, and his collaborators about what he termed stereotype threat. And the notion there is that if you're constantly faced with canards such as the only reason that African-American students are getting into good colleges is because of affirmative action, and they're not as academically able as their white peers, Steele found that the need to constantly disprove that by not only equaling but surpassing the performance of the white majority is exhausting. And it can at times lead students to actually fall into depression or give up. Incidentally, as an aside, he found the same thing for women who were studying mathematics and science at the university level. So there are a lot of challenges that have to do with social and economic conditions. And I'll say one more word about it with respect to international students. I don't want to lose I think they face some of the same problems. Since 9/11, there's obviously a lot of animosity towards students from Muslim countries. Since the pandemic, there is an uptick in discrimination toward students who are perceived as Chinese, many of whom in fact are not, but they're confused as Chinese because they're Asian. And this is on top of the normal acculturative challenges that international students face in adapting to a culture that's very, very different. The ways in which these things kind of work together is, for example, if you come from a culture, to give a very simple example, where people stand closer together than they do in the United States, that can be experienced as invasive. There's a strong correlation between English proficiency and the degree of acculturative distress. Asian students in particular, who are often not as proficient as in English as, say, students from India or European countries, are often seen as not as bright as American students because their grammar isn't as perfect or their accent isn't so easy to decipher. So we have all of this. Again, in the interest of time, I'll make one other quick remark and perhaps can circle back to it. You asked what can be done about it. Well, I think some of it is in not pathologizing the individual and acknowledging and affirming these forces that can be quite toxic, which is not to say to relieve people of individual responsibility. They still, that accountability and personal responsibility are not discordant with acknowledging social forces. And finally, Albert Einstein once said that what makes the world such a terrible place to live are not evil people. It's people who see evil and do nothing about it. So I think the notion of bystander intervention, training in that, but a culture that supports it, that doesn't let microaggression go unremarked upon, for example, either at the individual or structural level, is some of what we can do to help these students. Thank you so much for the question and the opportunity to ramble on about it.
Oh, that's great. I have many more questions for you, but I want to make sure I get into to Rory. Rory, thank you for waiting so patiently. And it just occurred to me, I was really looking forward to asking you the questions, since you're the only person who's not a shrink in this panel. So let me ask you this. I think the media has great opportunity to provide information to the public that is accurate, and hopefully help with misinformation and stigma. At the same time, sometimes perhaps unintentionally, the way mental health is reported can add to confusion, mistrust, stigma. And I think it would be very helpful for the audience if you could share some best practices when reporting mental health, and if we could include in that also the best practices when reporting suicide.
Yeah, thank you so much for the question, the opportunity to talk about this. I've learned a lot from the young people who I've interviewed about mental health over the years. And I think it's really important for us as reporters to think about the things that we can do for the people who trust us with their stories to make sure that it's as positive an experience for them as possible and as safe as possible. So I guess one thing to really consider when you're talking with youth is I think it's important to consider the idea of their consent to share their story as something that is an ongoing process. Whereas with, say, a politician, they tell you something on the record and then they call you up 5 minutes later and they're like, actually, can we take that off the record? You may not honor that request. I think when you're working with young people sharing these vulnerable things, it's really important to allow that to be something they decide to revoke at any time, and also to tell them that, because they may not realize that, or they may feel guilty if they tell you that you can use their story and then they change their mind. It's so important for their safety and well-being to tell them that that is always in their control and they can decide to back out of that at any time. I think it's also important to talk with them in advance about some of the pros and cons of disclosing their story publicly. There are a lot of pros, and going back again to what Dr. Ng was saying about validation and finding meaning, I've definitely seen that with a lot of the students who've shared their stories publicly. They find a lot of validation from the feedback they get, and certainly find meaning because they see their stories helping other people open up and helping other people find help. But it's also important for them to understand that, and a lot of young people already naturally understand that when something's on the internet, it could be there forever and people will search them later in life and find that. But it's good to prepare them for that and have them think about what kind of backlash they might see on social media, and also that people might end up reaching out. Sometimes people will find their Instagram profiles and DM them and say, I'm suicidal, can you help me? And so you have to make sure they're kind of prepared for that as best as possible and know where to direct people in case that happens. And I think it's great whenever possible to make sure the young people are consulting with a therapist if they have one, or a trusted adult in deciding whether to share their story. And then when you interview them, trying to do that as much as possible in their comfort zones where they choose the location of their choice, and with anyone present who they choose. If they want to have a parent there with them or a friend, doing whatever you can to accommodate that. And then keeping in touch with them throughout the process, so the story doesn't suddenly land on the front page and they didn't know it was coming. Giving them a heads up throughout the process about where you're at in the reporting. And then briefly going through some of the considerations for reporting on suicide. There's a website, reportingonsuicide.org, that has great suggestions. So I'll just hit kind of some of the highlights of that. It's in order to avoid any kind of contagion factor from reporting on suicide, one important consideration is to avoid using too many details of the suicide method, especially anything that could be considered potentially instructional or sensationalizing. You want to avoid any of that. And whenever possible, if you're writing about the subject of suicide, it's helpful to talk to people who've experienced suicidality but have survived, and can share a bit about what worked for them, how they did get the help they needed. And share context, information about warning signs and risk factors, so people can learn from your story about what they should look for in their loved ones, and information about how to get help if they need it. So I always like to include a list of resources at the end, including hotlines for anyone who might be immediately triggered. So yeah, those are my highlights.
That's great. Thank you so much. I think what all the points that you touched were so important and certainly resonated with all the panelists. I could just see everybody, nodding their heads. So thank you for sharing that. So it's still with you, Rory. You have talked about storytelling for youth with mental health challenges as an important way to reach out, young audiences. Can you describe how this is best done? A little bit of your experience with that.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think it can start even sometimes just between a patient and their therapist. Some therapists may use that as a way to move through trauma, just having a patient learn how to tell their own story. That can kind of help them heal and feel empowered with it. And then going beyond that, some young people may want to share with their peers or with their schools. And there are more and more organizations that are stressing that peer-led model. A couple big ones are Sources of Strength and the Hope Squad that are kind of getting bigger across the country and here in Wisconsin, that basically provide a framework for youth to lead their own mental health initiatives in their schools, which may include sharing stories. And then I'll also just plug our documentary. It's called You're Not Alone. And that features 4 students who share their stories. And we've done screenings of that. And after seeing that film, it often prompts young people to want to share their own stories too, just organically in the Q&A after the film, or just staying after and talking to each other. So I think anytime you can bring in materials like that, where you have real people sharing their stories, it can inspire other people to feel safe enough and comfortable enough to open up about their own stories.
Terrific. Thank you. So Warren, back at you. In following on something that Reach mentioned on health equity, we know that the pandemic has hit communities of color very, very hard. But most of the media reporting focus on the virus, the physical illness, the loss of life, less so on the mental health impact. So in your work with youth in communities of color, what has been your experience or observation? What has the psychological impact been on these communities?
Thanks, Dr. Baptista. Yet another incredibly important question, because as we all know, even if universally we've been through this pandemic, not all of us have been affected equally. And that is the ugly truth and cruel reality. particularly among communities of color who have been disproportionately affected, not only by COVID-19 and the pandemic and the antecedents to it, with higher infection rates, higher mortality, and chronic inequities, but just the fact that there is the longstanding systemic and structural racism and levels of oppression that make it harder to get the help even when you need it. So I think that with all of that, and I think Dr. Eichler also brought up the role of racialized trauma. And so we can't ignore the fact that Adam Toledo, 13 years old in Chicago, or Micaiah Brandt in Columbus, Ohio at 16 years old, and really the beginning of justice with the sentencing after the murder of George Floyd. I think all of these things in totality affect our young people, particularly our communities of color, as Dr. Eichler had said, whether or not it's a college campus or on the schoolyard or in our streets. So I think that the pandemic of racism continues to be a challenge, but I think that that is on top of everything else. So I think for children and adolescents, and I speak on behalf of all of our wonderful team members and colleagues working in Northern Manhattan to address the needs of our community, I think one of the things that has been very startling was the United Hospital Fund's ripple effect study in New York State, really showing after the first wave just how devastating COVID-19 was, particularly among communities of color. And within 5 months at the beginning of the pandemic, 4,200 children lost a parent or caregiver to COVID-19. But when you look at those numbers, it was 1 in 600 Black children, 1 in 700 Latinx children and adolescents who lost a parent or caregiver. And out of those numbers, about a quarter entered foster care and kinship foster care, and about half of them newly entered poverty, primarily because of the loss of a parent. I think this is not surprising when the hospitalization rate for African American as well as Latinx folks within the city was 5 times higher, and the death rate twice as high than other ethnic and racial groups. But I think for kids of color, I think it's really important for us to acknowledge the meaning of family, the loss of a loved one. And when you're trying to provide care within that context of this backdrop of the pandemic, but also with regards to all of the other levels of oppression that I had mentioned before, it's having to bear witness with also acknowledging the incredible strength and resilience within children as well as within communities to also heal and come together. So I think as much as we're talking about mental health, I do want to acknowledge the important role and the power within families, communities, and particularly communities of color, and that for all of us, not to be sort of focused just on the mental health perspective, but really on the strength resilience perspective as well. Because how we frame an issue can also invalidate the person's experience of it. We don't want to pathologize something that is definitely a part of one's lived experience. But at the same time, how do we bring meaning and value to when there is something that we can treat, a depression that we can acknowledge and the suffering that we can address. And I think being able to do all those things is what is meaningful. I think from a mental health perspective and as a child psychiatrist working in this community, I think it's really important for us how we frame the issues, but also how we learn about the antecedents as well as the underlying inequities that underline the care that we hope to provide and the work that we need to do, not only within mental health, but with regards to social justice and with regards to healthcare reform, which is really important. And I don't even want to get into the educational and all of the other issues that will be a part of creating solutions. So sorry, Dr. Baptista, you got me onto a soapbox because this is so important to me, and I know for my team members in terms of addressing these issues, particularly within communities of color. But I don't want to pathologize, but I do want to validate and acknowledge the challenges, but at the same time, the solutions go beyond mental health. And I think it's a broader approach to how do we address those underlying issues of systemic structural racism and oppression.
Thank you, Warren. I mean, certainly those are very important and real issues, and the best way to address it is to start with honest conversations. So I'm sure everybody, appreciate your honesty and transparency and passion about this. So let me try to take a few questions from the audience. So Mark, perhaps this goes to you. So a question from the audience here: is more utilization of mental health services a function of more acceptance of mental health issues among young people?
Yeah, well, I think we need to draw, I think in general, yes, we have, particularly in the pre-pandemic years, there is some evidence of broader acceptance. And, we've known for a long time that stigma and stigmatized attitudes, are a profound barrier and sometimes they're transmitted through families, or through peers, or through culture more broadly. And they can really impede a young person's finding a voice and coming forward and seeking care that he or she needs. Now, all of that may have been sort of thrown into the background in the COVID era over the last year and couple of months, in that there's now, as I mentioned before, so much more of the care is delivered remotely, over the internet, but that's done in person. There are now a whole other set of barriers that have come up, and there's a real fear that many people have for coming forward just into any healthcare setting, out of fear of transmission of the virus. So but I do think that underneath all of that we have seen, particularly if you step back and look over the decades, there has been a slow process of destigmatization, and it's the young people who've led the way. We really haven't seen much of a shift in attitudes among adults. People have thought, with a greater acceptance, particularly for more severe disorders of biological understanding for things like depression and schizophrenia, that would result in, diminishing stigma and improving attitudes. But we haven't really seen that yet, especially among adults. But there is some evidence that young people over the last decade or two have developed more pro-mental health attitudes, and I think it's been to their benefit.
Great, thank you. So Rich, perhaps this one goes to you. So another question from the audience. So what does access to mental health services at universities look like for non-traditional students who may not be Gen Z, such adult learners, student parents, etc.?
That's an excellent question. And it's another way in which the demographics on campuses have changed. For example, we have a great many military veterans attending college today on the Yellow Ribbon program, which is sort of the latter day version of the GI Bill. And that is a group that does not seek out mental health services readily. To Dr. Olson's point, especially with some of our older students, some of the stigma associated with seeking mental health services persists. And I absolutely, with no data, but just based on observation, agree with everything you said about the change in attitudes. So I think there has to be a great deal of outreach to these non-traditional populations. And I think the way in which services are provided can't just follow the traditional clinic model. When you have populations for whom it's culturally not normative to seek services, or there's even a lot of suspicion thereof, which is true of a lot of our military veterans, by the way, as well as many of our international students and so forth. So I think sometimes you have to go out into the community. You have to locate mental health professionals, who are better called counselors, to remove some of that stigma, in all sorts of non-traditional locations, in academic buildings, in residence halls. You have to be willing to have drop-in hours. At Columbia, we have a program where we have counselors sitting in these spaces doing what are called problem-solving hours. And some of the language is important, because when you talk about it, everything in terms of psychiatric diagnosis, for people who have, in some cases, well-deserved fear of what it means to be in a mental health system, because, well, we don't have to go into all the reasons. But that can be off-putting. Now, it's the same people. These are psychiatrists, they're psychologists, but we can give them a less clinical name, put them in a less clinical space. You can do things like and locate the problems, as I was talking about earlier, at least initially, in terms of reactions to environmental stressors, which is a lot less threatening to people than saying, I think you have a mental health problem. People don't want to be identified that way. Some of them may indeed have significant psychiatric problems, but if we can get them to seek services in less threatening environments, then sometimes that can be a gateway into the kinds of treatments that they need, to referral and so forth. And sometimes we do this with, there's a host of ways in which we do it. We will do groups that are about improving relationships. We'll do procrastination workshops. These things are pretty far removed from depression, major depressive disorders, and so on, but they become stepping stones for people who need a higher level of care to get comfortable with speaking to mental health professionals and discovering, hopefully, that they're caring, well-intentioned people. There are a host of creative programs. There's obviously not time to go into all of them, but I'm thinking about some of the things that Dr. Eames said earlier about promoting resilience, positive psychology. There have been some programs that are absolutely designed along those lines that are almost like classroom instruction that have proven pretty effective in reaching students of color and helping them to cope with some of the circumstances that they confront. I can't see the floor without thanking Rory for her remarks about reporting on mental health problems and suicide in particular. And I noticed that my colleague Maddie Gould is in the audience, who's an expert on suicide contagion, and I think she would endorse everything you've had to say. And we're all nodding because we understand the impact of reporting. And in speaking about access, and that's what made me think of it, when things are reported in a certain way, one of the things that I worry about is it'll alienate people who really need and could benefit from care. And I see that Maddie says, I endorse all that she said. So thank you, Rory.
Mark, did you have a comment?
No, just to really endorse what Richard was saying, that there have been some innovative programs that have been set up for counseling that are more attractive to young people, but they're the exception. I think it's an area where mental health services in our country has sort of fallen down somewhat. For the most part, they're provided in very traditional, very medicalized environment. And there's an insight that Bruce Link, who was a professor here for many years, had a number of years ago about this issue of stigma, and that is that people who have sort of internalized, stigmatized views about mental health and thinking about other people, if they themselves come under psychological distress, it's a real barrier. They turn those negative attitudes on themselves, and it can really interfere with their ability to reach out and get help. And so it's something that we all need to be thinking about as we're trying to communicate messages of health and hope.
Great, thank you. So we have 2 minutes. So what I'd like to do is the following. I'd like each of the panelists, don't think too much, just speak from the heart, some departuring words for our audience. So Rory, you have spent a lot of time with kids, K to 12. Lessons learned.
Gosh, well, I guess trying to expand from something I haven't already talked about. I think it's important for us, as has been talked about a lot on this panel, which I really appreciate, to look at social and environmental factors. And I think for young people can really relate to that and may not want to use medical language about their experience or see themselves as being mentally ill enough to mean they need to seek out help. And when we can talk about these social factors, especially for marginalized populations, I think people can come to see that the act of seeking help and self-care is an act of social justice, and they can see it in kind of a different lens that might resonate more with them than some of the pathologizing, as we've talked about. So I think anytime that we can talk about those topics can be really helpful.
Thank you. Warren, wearing your president-elect hat, where should the priorities be moving ahead when we're talking about policies and youth mental health? 30 seconds.
Okay, well, that's fast. Well, I would then check the ACAP website if you want all the answers, because then we'll have it online. But in 30 seconds, I think that what's really important is that we listen and we learn, because I think one of the things that we have to really do is listen carefully for not only the children and the youth, but also our communities and communities of color, and to listen to where we can partner, and really giving away our jargon, our status, our role, and our privilege, and sharing it to create a solution that works for all of us.
Thank you. Rich, what would you tell parents of college students?
Well, having done this for many years, I'm very hopeful about the young people today and their capacity to grow. But what I would like to say, and it's not just to parents, is we've gotten much better at treatment. We have better medications, we have better treatment techniques, but we'd much rather do prevention than intervention, especially crisis intervention. And that, of course, starts early on. And we need the resources. We have someone in the White House now who thinks that infrastructure should include things like early childhood education and the kind of care, home health care, and so on, the things that would support families, going back to parents, so that they can raise their children in a different way than someone struggling, working 3 jobs to put food on the table can. So I'll get off the soapbox, but I think that we start there. We start when they are very young, and parents can't do their jobs well if they don't have the support and the resources they need.
Thank you. Mark, you have the last word, and I'd like to stay with the hope message. What can you tell us about?
Sure. I think, and getting away from the research, this has been a stressful year for everyone, including parents. And I think that the extent to which parents can help support their children through this period is just so terribly important. And I know that Warren touched on some of these things, but just the importance of trying to get kids away from their devices and spending more time with their peers and more time with family. And, trying to, we've all been cooped up for a long time, getting more exercise and getting out and into the world safely. That all of those things have taken on, in a healthy way, may be able to do a lot to help us through what is a stressful and still quite uncertain time.
Thank you, Mark. So it's 6:03. So my apologies, my fault as the timekeeper, but I want to say thank you to our panelists. This was a great discussion. I think we went too fast, and I wish we had more time. I want to thank everyone who joined us tonight. And of course, I would be remiss if I did not acknowledge Linda Rosenberg, who was the mind behind this panel series and brought us together tonight. So thank you again, everyone, our panelists, Linda, and I hope everyone have a great evening.